brief video on critical literacy in close reading. I am Navan Govender from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow and presenting for the United Kingdom Literacy Association, or UKLA. In this video, I will outline close reading, which is a practice that is highly valued in English education and is most often associated with the study of literature. I argue that the kind of close reading that is valued by high school English curriculums, policymakers, and national examination boards could be seen as a first step toward a critical literacy approach to teaching and learning. I then hope to facilitate a critical reading of a speech that was delivered by Greta Thunberg at the COP24 conference in Poland at the end of 2018, using a tool for critical linguistic analysis that was developed by Hilary Jenks. Using this text as a springboard, I then suggest some activities and questions that secondary English teachers could use to engage their learners in more socially conscious and critical ways of doing reading in the classroom. Firstly, let us begin by unpacking what close reading is and the kinds of knowledge and skills it values. Showalter, in this extract, states that close reading can be a neutral first step in understanding literature by focusing on the text itself. This is true even for critical analysis, where a useful starting point is in developing the capacity to unpack how texts work by decoding the words, phrases, and sentences. We also need to engage with the structure of the text, or in other words, genre. In this sense, we will need to consider how those words and sentences have been arranged to fulfill a particular social function or purpose. Often this allows us to measure whether a text is appropriate or well-crafted. By paying attention to the text in detail, this helps us gain access to the author's intentions. And we cannot fully understand a text if we cannot firstly read and comprehend it. There is also some recognition that context, or the factors outside the text, contribute to how we read and the meanings we can make. While typical close reading tends to focus heavily on the context of authors, I argue that the context of readers matter too. That is, while certain meanings might be intended by the author, they are not always the same meanings that readers make. Who readers are, where they come from, what they know, and the connections they make to other texts influence the meanings that they can make. So perhaps what is problematic about this quote is its use of the word neutral. By positioning close reading as a neutral first step, Showalter overlooks how language use in the design of texts and meaning-making in the reading of texts are intrinsically connected to issues of identity, geography, culture, value systems, and power. It perhaps also makes it easy to stop the reading process before teachers and learners are able to begin constructing their own meanings, criticizing the ideas and language use of authors, and then engaging seriously with the social issues that texts raise. My fear here is that when teaching to standardized national exams, reading can be taught as separate from the lives of readers. Close reading, in turn, risks becoming and being taught as a formulaic method of decoding texts for their intended meaning, explaining how that intended meaning and expression is effective, even when it's not, and removing the reader's own identities, cultures, values, and ways of making meaning from this process. What space, then, might the typical close reading lesson provide learners with the opportunity to see and comment on how issues like gender, sexuality, race, culture, faith are represented through the stories they read? From a critical literacy perspective, on the other hand, literacy is conceived as a social practice that is intrinsically connected to identity, society, power, and ideology. That is, who a text designer is, where and when they construct texts, what social, linguistic, or cultural capital they do or do not have, and the value systems that they take up or resist influences how they produce texts. Similarly, how readers bring who they are, where and when they engage with texts, the social, linguistic, and cultural capital that they have access to, and the value systems that they have taken up or resisted to texts, and use this consciously or unconsciously to make meanings from text. This is what Brian Street refers to as an ideological model of literacy. Here, teachers and learners develop critical capacities to draw attention to implicit ideologies of texts and textual practices by examining issues of power, normativity, and representation, with the intent to imagine and construct more socially just futures. Unlike traditional close reading, a critical literacy approach requires that teachers and learners engage with text as positioned and positioning, and as partial representations of the world and human experience. This said, I think we will come to see how traditional close reading practices could constitute the first steps toward a more critical practice of reading. Following from Alan Luke's argument that critical literacy is and should be the new basis for language literacy and literary education, it becomes necessary for teachers and learners to use the classroom and the curriculum to explore the relationship between language literacy and power. Without doing this, we as teachers, learners, and teacher educators risk becoming a profession involved in the systematic and systemic reproduction and distribution of particular brands of linguistic capital. We also risk reproducing problematic norms and representations of differences in gender, sexuality, culture, age, disability, race, and so on. A critical literacy approach is therefore bent on positioning difference and diversity as productive resources for teaching and learning. There is no one way of doing critical literacy, and so it becomes important for teachers and teacher educators to explore the literature from the field and apply the principles of a critical literacy approach to the classrooms and communities within which they work. In this video, I make use of one such tool by Hilary Jenks. I have reproduced a rubric here. Drawing on the principles and practices of Norman Fairclough's model for critical discourse analysis, Jenks presents the grammar of language and power. As we can see, unlike traditional grammar, the items on this rubric foreground how different linguistic devices serve particular social and communicative functions. This comes from a history of Hallidayan systemic functional grammar, which sees language as a toolbox from which text designers make choices about what and how to create meaning. I would recommend reading Hilary Jenks's article from 2005 called Language and the Design of Texts for the more detailed explanation of how to use this tool for analysis. For now, let us focus on three main grammatical features: pronoun use, lexicalization, or more commonly known as word choice, and mood, or perhaps better known as clause structure. Critical literacy approaches require us to develop a keen awareness of the social effects of language use. So, for instance, pronouns do not only signal the subjects and or objects in a sentence, they also serve to create relationships between subjects, objects, text designers, and readers. Text designers might use the pronouns us, our, or we to construct relationships that unify some people on the basis of belief, culture, gender, race, and so on. That is, pronouns can be used to represent and emphasize sameness, but it can also be used to fragment by emphasizing difference and separateness and creating an us-them argument. Word choice relies heavily on established and shared cultural understandings. This is called connotation, where the meanings of words are developed through their intertextual connections with other words, images, scenarios, beliefs, and so on. By choosing particular words and drawing on particular connotations, text designers may make assumptions about their intended audience. Perhaps that being great, for instance, is the same as being heterosexual, white, male, and a citizen of a particular country. Words can also be selected to reposition the assumed norm. For example, by renaming a war as genocide, we might be able to draw on stronger emotional understandings of conflict and reveal the atrocities of violence. Finally, mood or clause structure helps us as readers to determine how the text designer positions themselves as having authority, as speaking the truth, as offering themselves and their ideas up for debate, or as authoritarian. Whether utterances are constructed as statements, questions, offers, or commands, therefore matters when talking about the interpersonal relationship that is set up between text designer and the reader or the viewer. It is important to note here that when applying this approach to the classroom, you may opt to use a different set of terminology for each of the linguistic devices and functions. This is, I think, absolutely fine, as long as the principles of critical literacy approach still inform the practices you and your learners engage in, as well as the kinds of questions you ask each other. Now let us apply this to a specific context. The following clip comes from COP24, which was the 24th International Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Greta Thunberg, a climate justice now activist, presented her speech before world leaders at this conference in 2018. While watching the video, pay attention to the use of pronouns, word choice, and clause structures. That is, who is spoken about and when. Who does Greta Thunberg refer to when she uses the words you, we, or our? Do you notice any patterns in the way these pronouns have been used to group or separate people? On what basis are these groups being unified or fragmented? What emotive words stand out in the speech? Are they words or phrases that she emphasizes when speaking? What are they and how do they make you feel about the overall message of the speech? Are these emotive words directed at a particular group of people? Is the choice of words typical to a public address like this? And finally, consider whether Greta Thunberg poses questions, makes offers, presents statements, or commands the audience by thinking carefully about the kinds of sentence structures that she uses throughout. Is there a pattern in the way sentences are constructed? From watching this video, how would you describe the mood of the text?
My name is Greta Thunberg. I am 15 years old and I'm from Sweden. I speak on behalf of Climate Justice Now. Many people say that Sweden is just a small country and it doesn't matter what we do. But I've learned that you are never too small to make a difference. And if a few children can get headlines all over the world just by not going to school, then imagine what we could all do together if we really wanted to. But to do that, we have to speak clearly, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. You only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you are too scared of being unpopular. You only talk about moving forward with the same bad ideas that got us into this mess, even when the only sensible thing to do is pull the emergency brake. You are not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that burden you leave to us children. But I don't care about being popular. I care about climate justice and a living planet. Our civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people to continue making enormous amounts of money. Our biosphere is being sacrificed so that rich people in countries like mine can live in luxury. It is the sufferings of the many which pay for the luxuries of the few. The year 2078, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children, maybe they will spend that day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything while there still was time to act. You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their very eyes. Until you start focusing on what needs to be done rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. We cannot solve a crisis without treating it as a crisis. We need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to focus on equity. And if solutions within this system are so impossible to find, then maybe we should change the system itself. We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. You have run out of excuses and we are running out of time. We have come here to let you know that change is coming, whether you like it or not. The real power belongs to the people. Thank you.
Here is a transcript of Greta Thunberg's speech. In the classroom, it would be useful to begin with a discussion on whole text meaning, allowing learners a chance to identify and discuss the themes from the text that stand out most to them. Guiding questions for this discussion might include: what parts of the speech interest you most and why? What do you know about Greta Thunberg and climate change? And why has she become in many ways the face of climate justice? What's the difference between climate change and climate justice? What do you think she means by climate justice specifically? Who is her audience and why does this matter? What do you think about the tone and register of the speech? What is the main point that Greta Thunberg is trying to make? And who do you think would agree or disagree with this point? Moving into a closer analysis of the text, learners can then highlight all the pronouns and perhaps in groups discuss whether or not they see any patterns in how the pronouns have been used. From the highlighted text on the screen, it becomes evident that there are three key uses of pronouns. 1. The use of I and my for first-person perspective. 2. The use of we and our for unification, grouping humanity at large, children or young people, and activists at different points. And 3. The use of they and you for fragmentation, where they refers to the youth of the future and you refers to the adult world leaders in the audience at COP24. Each pattern of language use and its social function can therefore be named before building a further explanation about its social effects and links to ideology. Keep in mind that ideology refers to value systems, norms, and assumptions. The value systems at play include individual agency, where Greta Thunberg uses a first-person perspective to claim authority and appeal to everyday people by personalizing her address. Unifying both young people and activists disrupts the conventional understanding that children are innocent and passive bystanders in world politics. And fragmentation, or differentiating between those who are seen to have a political power and those who do not, allows Greta Thunberg to place responsibility on world leaders for the current climate crisis. Now, looking at word choice, learners could repeat the activity of highlighting and constructing meaning from the patterned use of language. Here, the word choice reveals four main relationships. The power of foregrounding voices, places, and people who are conventionally thought of as having little to no voice or impact. The plea to be direct is reified in both the word choice and the tone of the speech. By juxtaposing words like luxury and suffering, the inequities of the climate crisis are revealed. And the use of words with strong emotive connotations adds to the direct tone. Again, this reveals the value systems working in and beyond the text. The use of words with strong negative connotations disrupts the usual euphemized diplomatic ways of speaking by politicians and other world leaders. The use of emotive language appeals to humanity at large, disrupting the often sanitized version of reality that world leaders tend to construct. And by repeating certain words or words with similar meanings, the common term climate change becomes more and more entrenched as a crisis. Finally, identifying the patterned use of clause structures helps identify the overall mood of the text. The dominance of statements suggests that Greta Thunberg speaks directly and frankly and constructs her ideas as truth claims. Consider how present tense, present continuous, and past continuous tense are all used to show processes that have started and that show no concrete side of ending. At key points, modality is used to create a little more uncertainty. uncertainty includes words such as could, might, should, can, and so on, and express varying degrees of uncertainty. In each case, Greta Thunberg speaks about the future with possibility rather than certainty. This is paired with the use of conditional sentences that use an if-then formula. If something happens, then something else will result. This causality is again used to refer to the possibilities of a more just future. Yet again, Greta Thunberg's speech illustrates how her ways of speaking disrupt convention. The use of clear, precise statements supports the direct tone of the speech, placing the speaker in a position of authority. This disrupts the normative rhetoric of politicians that often use euphemism, diplomacy, hedging, and other devices that help them hide or minimize the material effects of their decisions. This sense of authority is aided by the use of certainty and repetition. Only with regard to the possibilities for the future does Greta Thunberg open up the space for uncertainty. The present, however, is positioned as a description of indisputable fact. Even with the close reading, it becomes evident that certain social issues stand out, what literary analysts euphemize and call themes. The climate crisis and issues of class inequalities are explicitly dealt with in the text. The use of pronouns, word choice, and clause structure helps us as readers to gain access to how these social issues are regarded by the text designer. That is, Greta Thunberg repositions climate change as a climate crisis, indicating the urgency of the matter. She also expresses the material effects of this crisis on the marginalized majority who suffer the material consequences of the actions of a powerful few, and the responsibility that needs to be taken by world leaders. But if we consider more than just what is in the text, other social issues emerge. It is not insignificant that Greta Thunberg is a young woman speaking directly to world leaders who are predominantly older men. By her very act of standing up and speaking to this particular audience in the way that she does, and then calling them out for a history of damaging decisions, Greta Thunberg subverts conventional relationships of gender. Furthermore, as a young person, Greta Thunberg repositions the youth as agentive, political, intelligent, and powerful. This disrupts any notion that youth only ever means innocence and passivity. As a person with Asperger's, Greta Thunberg also repositions conventional notions of ability. Both the tone and rationality of her approach to the climate crisis subvert the normative deficit understanding of ability and disability. And over and above these social issues, further issues may arise as more and more people take up or resist Greta Thunberg's call for climate justice. For instance, Greta Thunberg's whiteness and belonging to a developed nation perhaps worked in her favor in becoming a figurehead for climate activism. How many other activists of color and indigenous people go unnoticed? For instance, watch the video response from an organization called the Friends of Science and go through the same processes of identifying and explaining the pronouns, word choices, and clause structures. Use these linguistic and other resources to deconstruct the text and pinpoint the ideologies and interests at work. This particular text will reveal further details about Greta Thunberg's COP24 speech, so revisit that later on as well. Once you've watched and deconstructed both texts, consider this question: how does each speaker represent the environment and humanity's relationship to it? Who is named as responsible? Who is called to action? And what does each speaker value? If you can name the social issues, then you can begin to understand how they work and what can be done about them. Furthermore, as readers, we can make better decisions about when and how we want to take up or resist the positions presented to us in texts. Finally, it is useful to consider how the activities and processes we engaged in this video help us think about critical literacy as an approach to teaching and learning more broadly. 1. No text is neutral. All texts are positioned and positioning, and so it is the job of critical literacy teachers and learners to unpack how texts serve the interests of some over others. Texts are imbued with power and ideology. That is, language use happens in context and is used to represent a version of the world. Ideology is about values, and how these values shape the world is represented through text. Critique requires moving beyond the aesthetic by interrogating not only text designers' intended meanings, but also the actual meanings that readers and viewers bring to texts. That is, to consider the parts that make up the text, whole text meanings, the intended and received meanings, and the conditions under which the text is produced and received. For a further resource, visit the Critical Literacy in Scotland blog for an example of how I use critical literacy to engage with a literary text by Liz Lochhead. For more resources, join UKLA. My name is Navan Govender. Thank you for joining me.
All right, so hi everyone. I just want to say thank you for joining me today, and I hope the video made sense. I'll be looking out for the questions, for any questions that come through, or even any points of comments, and perhaps it's possibly a useful place to start, like while those come through, to say that the approach that I've taken in trying to incorporate a critical literacy approach to reading text isn't actually just a set of strategies, right? So the tool that I used here for linguistic analysis by Hilary Jenks is useful because it gives us a way of kind of engaging with the critical in critical literacy, but it's also, but critical literacy is in itself a disposition or an orientation toward text, and it is in that ability that we're able to spot the social issues that are embedded in texts, as well, and so how texts function socially to kind of reproduce or maintain certain relationships of power. And I think I know that there are a range of resources available through research and online and work being done by teachers that engage with this in different ways. So I'm hoping that this was just kind of a taster of what that means, or what that might look like. Obviously, I also work at a university, so I have the tendency to speak in like academic language, which is not great. But it does mean that how we speak about texts must also be kind of situationally, or must take the situation and the people involved into regard. So they are easier and perhaps more accessible ways of talking about this. I know Hilary Jenks's work tries to do this by making what are ultimately research methods and theory-driven processes very accessible and applicable to a high school or school-level learner. So I've seen just a question came in terms of differentiation. What would you suggest when approaching a text such as the speech? Would you offer a glossary or pre-highlight? Yeah, I think that is quite useful. I know so this session was actually based on a seminar run with the PGDE English students, and just the process of working in groups and identifying, kind of systematically identifying the words and then stopping and talking about. So for instance, we identified and highlighted all the pronouns, and then we stopped. We spoke about it, everyone shared ideas, and that seemed to have broken down the process. So, carefully scaffolding each step of the way with learners, and sometimes working with mixed ability groups where different learners would be able to pick up on different things and kind of talk through what they're noticing before it becomes something kind of more formal in a whole class discussion. But yeah, so I would say try and start off with the simple features evident in the text, and this is why I think it's important for teachers to have done this kind of critical analysis first, so that they can determine, well, which of the features would learners be able to pick up on, versus which ones would they need a little more time or a little more input in order to tackle. I do like the idea of kind of pre-highlighting resources as well, for instance, or asking learners to work with smaller extracts before moving on to larger texts. Right, so I'll see if I can keep working with some of the questions. So there's a question here about, using critical reading to reframe close reading. So how do students respond to this in my experience? So again, some of this brings up a range of issues, right? So because whether this kind of reading and the extent to which this kind of reading is practicable in schools is also context driven, right? So students that I've worked with, again, because I work with PGDE students, a lot of this practice in schools, or the access that I have to how learners or school-going kids are using it, is through them when they test out some of these ideas and kind of work with these approaches during their placement and in their probation years. And it brings up a number of issues. So one of the issues is that, yes, scaffolding is necessary because it's a way of working with individual words and phrases and kind of working with the details of texts. It's very easy to lose sight of the whole text meaning. Equally, it's very easy to perhaps identify some of the social issues if they're explicit in the text, and then kind of get caught up in the social issues and lose track of the fact that it's an English classroom and that you're teaching language and literature and literacy. So it's some of the trickiness around it is about maintaining that connection between language, like a concern for language, and its social effects. The positive is that because you by making social issues explicit means that you're bringing the way the author has constructed the text into the real world. Learners feel that they can actually express, and students feel that they can actually express their opinions about it and be critical and argue their points. So we do find that both university students and school-going learners are sometimes more engaged and feel that they have a way of speaking back to these texts, and that they're not just learning to appreciate the text for apparently what they're good at doing. It's the same thing with literature. The literature represents a particular perspective and context and viewpoint, and so learners feeling like they have the authority to comment on that means that they're potentially more engaged with it. So some of the questions. So to what extent do you think that the 3 areas you described would match the requirements from the English GCSE curriculum? All right, so I guess full disclaimer, I work in Scotland, and so I don't have a very in-depth knowledge of the GCSEs and the English system, but under similar constraints, the policy and the kinds of documents or kind of requirements that teachers need to work with can be tricky, right? And so some of this does start to reveal the systemic issues in education across the UK and across a number of other countries. And so it would mean that there is some compromise that might need to take place. I know with some of the teachers and students that I work with that there are certain parts of the curriculum that you can't do this work with texts. In other parts of the curriculum, so for instance, if you're teaching toward the GCSEs or any national framework or even toward national exams, then it's also about using this process to talk about and demystify assessment. Learners and students seem to understand that they can make decisions about how to respond to texts and the limitations of, and how to respond to exam-based questions or curriculum-based questions in a particular way when they know why those questions have been created the way they have, or what function those questions have, and the text, so their responses as text, what functions those texts serve. It also means that they know who their audience is and they can make clear decisions about how to use language in order to respond to those questions and to what markers want. So some of this process of kind of doing critical literacy and doing this kind of critical reading is about demystifying that whole process of designing texts and responding or interacting with them. So here I've got, how can I adapt this for primary school, year 6? All right, so that's a really interesting one. If anyone has read, so whether you work in primary, secondary, or higher education, please read work by Vivian Vasquez. So there's some more recent work, but her initial work in a book called Negotiating Critical Literacies with Young Learners or Young Children is phenomenal. She explores how working with kindergarten age kids, how it is possible to develop a critical literacy curriculum. So again, it's within the constraints of a national framework or understanding of what good teaching and learning looks like and what it means to be literate. There's certain strategies often based on kind of inquiry, getting learners to see issues and see how language is used in context, and then being able to spot who's been included or excluded, and then taking action based on that, whether it means producing another text or writing a letter or getting involved in the community or speaking to someone in the school to change how school systems run. It's a fascinating example of how that works. And so working with predominantly English high school student teachers and teachers, that's still a text that I refer them to think about, well, this is work, the kinds of questions that Vasquez, that people like Vasquez ask, are the kinds of questions we can be asking throughout kids' schooling careers, and really should start as early as we can. All right, lovely to see some comments about how people have been using kind of Greta Thunberg's work and speeches. She's got a fantastic little book, which is definitely worth getting. The speech or any kind of this rhetorical text is really useful because learners are also exposed to those kinds of texts, and often, I mean, we're described as living in a post-truth era. So these kind of critical skills of being able to spot what's happening and what's being said, and then to evaluate it and to make decisions based on what you know, right? To be an inquiring kind of person is becoming more and more necessary. Okay, some funny comments. When I did my English degree, the author was dead. Looks like they've come back. Yes, right. So again, it's completely necessary to talk about intended meaning, and I think this is, so rewatching this video and this thing that I constructed, I realized that I've maybe essentialized that relationship. That you're either doing close reading, or like there's traditional close reading and then there's critical literacy, and it's not quite that simple. The steps that you take for doing close reading in schools is brilliant. It's just that sometimes it has the potential, because it's exam or assessment driven, it has the potential to stop at a level of comprehension where learners are primarily concerned with whether or not the authors were effective. Right? And then there's an underlying assumption that the authors are effective, and that the themes that they represent through the text that they've created, whether it's a literary text or a more kind of media-based text, that it includes universal themes. And so while some themes are applicable across different contexts, I think it's important to start asking some of those questions about how the text, or what social effects the texts have, right? And that those texts don't exist in isolation, and that when learners start reading a text, they're making connections to the text that they've seen before and that they know, and that potentially gives them access to a range of meanings that not everyone else could make, and that they're reading it very differently. So I know with my students, we've spoken about how who we are as readers immediately has an effect on how we think about the texts that we're reading and the kinds of meanings that we can make, because we're making connections to our cultures, to the language repertoires, to our experiences. So there's a range of things happening, and so kind of asking those questions consistently about what are authors doing, what are they trying to do, what's actually happening, and what meanings are you making, and how do all of those things interact, and kind of how are they interconnected, I think becomes important. Often this is assumed to be kind of a higher order skill, but it must start from the basics. It is about reading and understanding and thinking first, and slowly moving toward building that understanding toward more and more critical kind of ways of thinking. So I said so another comment came through. I was interested in your comment at the beginning that structure is the same as genre. Not sure I agree with you. Could you expand on that idea? All right, so when I speak about genre or structure, I like to think of genre as a kind of organizing framework, right? So we can organize texts according to their purpose, right, or social function. So you have informative texts, explanatory texts, another such texts, creative texts, story narratives. But then you also have other ways of defining genre in terms of like literary genre. So whether it's detective or romance or gothic horror, but each of those texts, so their purpose also shapes the text. So there are particular things that we come to expect, particular elements that make up the bones of those texts, and that's what I mean by structure. There's usually a logic behind how ideas are organized, and the sequence that they take, and the kinds of language that we use. So explanatory texts tend to, or informative texts tend to try to be very clear and explicit, very direct language, but again, sequentially starts from simple ideas, explaining simple ideas and building on to become more complex, right? Showing connections as you go along. Imaginative texts or creative texts, like fiction, tend to be a little looser. So there's a little more play with the genre, with the structure of the text. But there's certain features around plot and characterization that still need to be maintained. But so what this also means is that those structures that define those genres are culturally embedded, right? So this means that there's a particular way of telling stories, for instance, or of explaining an idea that we might not realize is a very Western way of doing it, or a very English way of doing it, right? So speaking English, this is the way we explain. We like to be very explicit, very clear, and there are certain figurative words that we can use for more creative or imaginative texts. If you work with people who speak English in Southern Africa, for instance, their ways of telling stories are very different. So even if Southern African authors write an imaginative or fictional text, it can take a different shape. And so the genre starts to shift, the very structure starts to change. And I think that's what I mean. It's about unpacking whether or not those genres reflect the ways people tell stories across different cultures. It's probably a very long answer for what you might have been hoping to be a relatively simple response. So the next question is, do you have any thoughts on which teachers can make use of this approach? Would you be assuming English teachers, or would you be assuming all teachers of academic subjects? So the particular tools that I tend to use are for languages, specifically because I work in the field of English. And literacy. I do tend to focus on English teachers and English teaching, but it is possible to ask these questions about a range of texts, and so from different disciplines. Okay, so for instance, when we talk about disciplinary literacies or literacy across the curriculum with our PGDE students, we look at a range of texts. For geography students, for instance, we look at how the kinds of maps that have become normalized or naturalized as part of the discipline in classrooms. You have the difference between, and whether or not we explicitly get learners in a geography classroom to look at how Mercator projection maps versus Peterson projection maps present us with different understandings or different perspectives of the world, right? And how just those maps maintain or sometimes reproduce problematic understandings of the world, right? Around how big countries are, how big social issues in those countries might be compared to global politics, about how easy it is to travel, about where infrastructure is, about north-south divides, so there are stereotypes or problematic assumptions made about developed versus developing nations, and these are sometimes embedded in the very text that geography teachers use as their staple. So the question is, are we asking learners questions about the kinds of texts that are typical to our disciplines? And so you can take this kind of critical literacy a lot further across disciplines. And so there has been a lot of research and work done in that area. Elizabeth Burr-Modje is an example of a person who's done kind of work in literacy across the curriculum from this kind of social justice perspective. The tools that I tend to use do tend to focus on language specifically, but we do try and also broaden our definition of what counts as a text. So analyzing visual text, for example, in language classrooms as part of media studies is still really important, and looking at the grammar of visuals or of sound and of drama is also applicable to these kinds of questions. So we've also got the conundrum for me is that critical analysis is not neutral either, as those who conduct critical analyses have their own ideologies. Yes, I'm hoping that if you get to rewatch this video, the video that I did, you'll see some of the, perhaps even some of the problematic things that I might be picking up on or not picking up on. I think that's completely right. I think if you can identify how I understand Greta Thunberg and her work through that analysis, then you'll be able to pick up my position, and that is critical literacy work. So this means that it is sometimes uncomfortable. I remember running a course on gender and language with undergraduate student teachers, and I still remember the phrase. One student kind of put their hand up and said, I don't like this critical literacy thing. The person in the text is not here to defend themselves, and here we are talking about them. And that was it. That was the critical point. It made me feel incredibly uncomfortable at the time and caught me off guard. But that was part of the point. She was doing the work. And so sometimes it does mean that learners or colleagues will see the gaps in what you're doing. But because nothing is neutral, everything is positioned and positioning, it is completely right to start negotiating that. What's important, though, is that it's not just phrased as conflict, that the difference in perspectives is a productive force, right? So we're interested in the fact that, so I as a person see certain things. So identity allows me to see certain issues and spot particular patterns in text and make particular meanings. But there are limitations to the kinds of meanings that I can make, right? So the question of whiteness and gender and age came up in the Greta Thunberg speech. But there are certain, so as a person of color, there are certain things that I can see, but as a person of color, there are certain things that I cannot see. As a person who identifies as male, I perhaps can see some of the significance behind Greta Thunberg being a young woman standing up against other men in what is typically a male-dominated arena. But identifying as male also has limitations on how I understand a female, feminine, or a feminist experience. And it's necessary to understand those limitations and those affordances. And so it's also necessary that we're in constant conversation with a broad range of people and perspectives in order to offset the limitations that we have as individuals. Right, so I think we've got like 4 minutes left, so I'll go through. I see there's quite a few that have come through, quite a few questions and comments. So, would you use this approach only for the critical analysis of text, or do you see a direct link into the teaching of writing also? yes, I think there's always a link between reading and writing. To use reading as a means to get into writing and to use writing as a means to engage with reading is always necessary. I think we must see those two as deeply connected. And often for critical literacy, the concept of design or redesign is very useful for thinking about how to get into writing, right? So we talk about design because we also recognize that there are multiple text types and ways of designing text. So if you're looking at writing specifically, redesign might allow us to pinpoint perhaps the problems in a text and redesign it from a new perspective, right? So if you're noticing that the characters in text are in relatively or represented as relatively sexist, right? So they're very normative. Maybe your female character is very passive and your male character is very dominant. So it just reproduces a normative gender binary. Learners can then rewrite extracts or rewrite a story, repositioning those characters, or find texts that or explore text that does that kind of work. It also means that so redesign allows us to rewrite a text from a new perspective. Design also allows us to speak from within our own perspectives. So learners then can apply the principles and the critiques of a text to thinking about, well, hold on, how would I write a story from my own context? How would I use language? Where would I set the story? Does it help that the story is set in my own community? How does this change? How is this different from the kinds of characters and the settings of stories that we see typically in the stories that we read, right? So writing becomes a really powerful tool for production, and to see that language use is not about just reading and critiquing, but that we can now, having a deeper understanding of the text that we've read, we can now produce texts in more socially just and authentic ways. I'll take one one more. So there's a quick comment. Well, a comment here. This speech gained influence through its dissemination via YouTube and was much more widely disseminated than the Friends of Science one. Should we talk with students about how text move through social media as part of the discussion about text, power, and context? For example, in talking about how conventional relations might be subverted. Yes, right. So again, the movement of text is, and I'll wrap up on this idea. Just looking at the time, the movement of text is vital. With learners having so much access to online material and to now predominantly engaging with texts through online platforms, understanding how texts circulate and why some become more powerful than others and why some are taken up and some are resisted through online spaces is critical, and begs the question of whether or not we're participating and how we're participating in the dissemination of fake news, misinformation, authentic text, reliable text. How do we know that what we're sharing is worth sharing and what the potential social effect is going to be? Okay, so tons of comments, and I'm really glad. Thank you so much for engaging. It is now just after 1:30. From what I understand, the video will be uploaded, and my contact details are on that. So if there are people who are interested in keeping this conversation going, I'd love to hear from others. All right, and thank you very much for joining me. I hope this was useful. Your comments have been super useful for helping me rethink some of these ideas as well, and help complicate some of the things that I think are just normal. But thank you very much. Take care and stay safe.